Hello, today's PowerPoint video will be on Inspector Calls and character study. The 6 characters that we're going to look at are Mr. Burling, Mrs. Burling, Sheila, Eric, Gerald and Inspector Girl. If there are demands for it, I will upload an Eva Smith PowerPoint video in the future. So I hope you find this useful. And any questions, please leave in the comments and I will endeavour to answer them for anyone who wants them. Okay, so if we're looking at Mr. Burling then. Okay, so when Mr. Burling is introduced within the stage directions at start, Priestley describes him as a heavy-looking, rather pretentious, easy manners, but rather provincial in his speech. Now, as we know, if we have studied Inspector Calls, Mr. Burling came from a working class background. He's worked incredibly hard in his life to get to where he is. Okay, and that is seen later on in the stage directions where Mrs. Burling, his wife, is described as his social superior because she was born into wealth already. Okay, so the fact that it shows this is that he's rather provincial in his speech. Okay, if he's rather provincial, it shows that he's unsophisticated in his language. Okay, which shows that he still has these working class roots. Okay, hard-headed businessman. He has made himself wealthy by being a hard-headed businessman. Okay, now a little bit of intertextuality and J.B. Priestley's non-fiction. Something called the postscripts, and they were written between 1940 and 1942. Now these are online with a search, or you can buy the actual postscripts. I will try to post a link in the comments for you to be able to read through these, but these were broadcast on the radio and they were J.B. Priestley's radio shows. So these are the transcripts of his radio broadcasts and they were between 1940 and 1942. Now if we remember, Priestley wrote Inspector Calls in 1945. Okay, but even here, 3 to 5 years earlier, he talks about businessmen being hard-headed men. Okay, so early on, it shows his beliefs and his influences for Mr. Burling. Okay, his wife is his social superior, so yeah, as we mentioned, she was born into wealth. Okay, so she is already superior to Mr. Burling. Anxious, as he came from a working class background. Okay, so something that I learned from CPD from Edward Seeley is this idea of anxiety being a key theme throughout Inspector Calls. Now, the reason we've put this is that Mr. Burling's anxious due to stereotypical views of that patriarchal society and the bourgeois family. Okay, this middle upper class family. He feels anxious to be able to provide for his family and to fulfill the roles of this patriarch. Okay, we see that he's arrogant at the beginning of the play. Yeah, and that is shown through Priestley's use of dramatic irony. And I say there isn't a chance of war and the Titanic is absolutely unsinkable. Okay, now right at the beginning, as soon as we hear, as an audience, we hear him speak, we lose any kind of faith, any kind of trust in Burling as a character from that very beginning. Okay, whatever he is saying, we know as an audience, does not come true. Okay, so because of that, Mr. Burling is already on the back foot in terms of response from an audience. Okay, so let's look at a few more quotes. Okay, so clothes mean something quite different to a woman, not only something to make them look prettier. Okay, now here, this shows his patronising views towards women. Again, stereotypical of this patriarchal society in the Edwardian times. Okay, it shows that he doesn't believe that the clothes are just something to make them look pretty. It shows that they mean something else, and that hidden meaning there of these clothes shows that he doesn't really understand what women want. Okay, a time in which Crofts and Burlings are no longer competing but working together for lower costs and higher prices. Okay, so again, this is where he's talking to Gerald and he's discussing about his company and Gerald's father's company, and that they've always been friendly rivals in business for a long time. But now he is getting married to his daughter Sheila. He's optimistic. He's positive that they will come together and they will, rather than compete, they will work together and they will lower the costs and charge higher prices through them working together. In essence, this capitalistic view, okay, shows his greed, that he doesn't care about the competition, he doesn't care about who he's going to bring down in that, he's just bothered about making money. Okay, so his daughter's marriage actually seems to be a marriage of convenience, a business deal, as opposed to a marriage of feelings. Okay, now if we look at that in more detail, the Crofts are on a higher social standing in society, Okay, so that's where he wants the two companies to join. Okay, so again, we've got another quote that is stereotypical of this patriarch. Is there any reason my wife should answer questions from you, Inspector? Okay, so we've got this possessive pronoun, my. Okay, again, showing that stereotypical view of this patriarch, and that the man is the head of the house, and the wife should not be answering anything that he deems unacceptable. Okay, but maybe does he feel self-conscious that he doesn't deserve his wife, and so he doesn't allow her to speak in the play? Okay, at this specific moment, he wants to appear on a higher standing, on a higher grounding than his wife. So could that be a potential reason as to why he doesn't let her speak? Just something else to look at. Okay, so Mrs. Birling, she's described at the beginning as being about 50, a rather cold woman, and her husband's social superior. Okay, so as we mentioned in the previous slide, social superiority basically means she was born into an upper class family. She's been naturally wealthy and has a higher footing within society than her husband. Okay, now the second quote there, Arthur, you shouldn't say such things. That's in reference to her husband complimenting the cook on their meal. Okay, now again, we've got this cold-hearted nature of Mrs. Birling. It shows her upper class values. Now, the fact that they've got their own cook to prepare this meal, now because of where they are in society, because of their standing in society, she doesn't understand why her husband needs to compliment. It should just be expected. It should not be any different. Okay, but there you see Mr. Birling's still working class values, appreciating the little things in life. Okay, now something that we will touch upon is this idea that Mrs. Birling's ideals and these values are very much rooted in Victorian ideals, are very much rooted in Victorian values. Even though the play is set in Edwardian times, her values are very much Victorian in that. We'll go on to it further, but this idea that the woman is inferior to the man, okay, and it should be this obedient wife, and this whole idea of the class system. Okay, you've got this idea that naturally the upper class, the working class do not mix, and the upper class should not really be complimenting or commenting upon something that the working class have achieved. Okay, so another quote here from Mrs. Birling. When you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had. Now, this is further supporting these ideas of the Victorian values. Okay, so during the Victorian times, women and wives were seen to be obedient towards their husbands or towards the men. Now, this quote, I would argue, supports these ideas, and she tries to enforce them on her daughter. Okay. Obviously, Sheila's questioning where Gerald was throughout the summer. And Mrs. Birling interrupts and says, you've just got to get used to it. This is what they do. They need to spend all their time on the business. But actually, as it turns out, Sheila was actually right to question what Gerald was doing. Okay, and here again, you see that conflict between the younger and the older generation. And actually, do the younger generation seem to know more than the older generation? Okay, so a slide that I did steal is this lack of trust in women actually having a brain. Okay, now even though Mrs. Birling is the social superior, she again highlights these Victorian values of the woman being obedient. Okay, so we've got the quote here: "It's not true, Gerald, you must know, and you're a man." Now, Sheila, who spends all her time with Eric, her brother, she should know him more than what Gerald does, who doesn't actually see him outside of the household of the Birlings. Okay, but Mrs. Birling actually prefers to take the word of someone who openly admits that he sees very little of Eric because he's a man. Okay, so even though her daughter understands Eric much more than Gerald, just because Gerald is this male figure, this male dominant figure, she listens to him over her daughter. Perhaps because she doesn't want to see her son Eric as weak. Okay, and again, he's a man, so he needs to have this positivity, this natural aura of dominance. Okay, so let's move on to Sheila. So this is one of the younger generation of the family. Sheila is in her early 20s. Her character development is shown throughout the play. Okay, so at the start she appears very childish, quite immature. However, towards the end, we see her maturing and becoming quite insightful, especially from other characters. And she is actually the first character to begin to feel a sense of remorse for what she has done. Okay, she begins to feel sorry for what has happened to Eva Smith, Daisy Renton. Okay, so again, a couple of quotes from Sheila. "I'm sorry, Daddy, actually, I was listening." Now, if we look at this first quote, okay, we do at the start have these ideas that the female is obedient, okay, and it shows that she's quick to apologise. "I'm sorry, Daddy, actually, I was listening." Yeah, she wants to impress and she wants actually to behave well for her father. Again, it's very stereotypical of the Edwardian times and the patriarchal society that families lived in. And again, use of that noun daddy. Now it could either show that she's still quite childish and immature, or just representing those values of the bourgeois family. Okay, so there's a couple of ideas there. Okay, so the second quote: "But these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people." Now this here is the start of Sheila accepting and questioning the capitalistic view of her father. Okay, this could show her socialist views coming forward. Okay, now I would say that Priestley deliberately uses Sheila as the vehicle for change. He uses her character to show that people will change in the future, or that they've got the potential to change in the future. And then the inspector is then used as the catalyst for what will happen if we don't change, and that message that Priestley wants to get across. But actually, as a construct, I would say Sheila is this idea, is that main focus, that there is potential for the younger generation to still change their ways. Okay, and the third quote then: "Yes, of course it is. That's what I meant when I talked about building up a wall that's sure to be knocked flat. It makes it all harder to bear." Now this here, it shows her change. It shows that development of character that we've said. Okay, now development of character is a technique that you can use, that you can talk about within an essay that you are writing, if it was about Sheila, or if it's about the difference maybe between the younger and older generation. It shows that she's become more mature. And as I mentioned before, it shows that she's more insightful. Okay, she can see things that the other characters cannot. Even though she's this young girl, she's in her early 20s, she appears at this moment in time more mature and more accepting than both her father and her mother. Okay, she uses this metaphor of building up a wall to show her understanding of the inspector's methods. Okay, she is trying to get across that building up this wall for the inspector is not going to work because he will just knock it down, and that is made reference to earlier in the play. Okay, Eric then. Eric's obviously the son of Mr. and Mrs. Birling, sorry. He is half shy, half assertive. Now, Eric could feel pressure to become like his father and become the owner of the business. Now, half shy, half assertive shows that he lacks confidence. Okay, we see later in the play that Eric then drinks to appear more confident and to escape the realities of his life. Again, linking back into this idea of anxious or anxiety, could it be that Eric feels anxious to perform at the same level of his father, to follow in the footsteps, and to fulfill that stereotypical role of the male in the household, that he is this hard-headed businessman, but actually he is still the same generation as Sheila, and maybe he doesn't feel comfortable in doing that, which is why we see him drinking and maybe appearing weaker than what he actually is, because he wants to escape these realities. He wants to get over this anxiety of fulfilling those roles of this patriarch and his family's expectations. Okay, so a few quotes here by Eric. I don't know really. Suddenly I felt I just had to laugh. Okay, now, as we say, in the stage directions it describes him as half shy, half assertive, in that he lacks confidence. Now this, again, supports the idea that he's uncertain and unsure of himself. Okay, so at the beginning of the play he tries to speak up, but he is often talked down by his father. Okay, now a prime example of this is when he questions his father about refusing the wage increase and says, you know, they don't have a choice if nowhere will take them on. Mr. Birling actually shuts him down and responds by saying, look, just you keep out of this. You hadn't even started in the works when this happened. Now, if we look at that, you can see why Eric is kind of unsure of himself. He's questioning his father and his father's ideals, but actually every time he questions him, he just gets put down. He just gets shut down from his father. So maybe he has this pressure of him not feeling ever as good as his father. Okay, but because he's questioning, we again see that potential for change in that younger generation. Okay, so quote 2, bursting out. What's the use of talking about behaving sensibly? You're beginning to pretend now that nothing's really happened at all, and I can't see it like that. This girl's still dead, isn't she? Nobody's brought her to life, have they? Okay, so Eric becomes here quite emotional, I would argue, towards his family, and has finally grasped the gravity, that severity of the situation at hand. Okay, so like Sheila, okay, of the same generation, we see him begin to question his family. Now actually there could be another sense to this though. Could he be covering up his own guilt and his own part in this? Now we know what Eric has done. We know that Eric went to the Palace Bar, picked up Eva Smith, Daisy Renton as she was then, and actually it's not specifically mentioned, but raped her. Okay, she did not consent to his ideas of sexual intercourse, and then got her pregnant. Now, does he feel a tinge of guilt towards what he has done, and he actually just is deciding to blame other people? Now, I'm sure, as other teachers may have said, always use tentative language. We don't know if that is what Priestley was intending, or Priestley's intentions were to show that Eric is also that vehicle for change or potential change in the younger generation. So what you really need to do is to explore the different alternative meanings of one specific quote and a specific technique. Okay, he's bursting out then, so the use of that stage direction can either show that he's angry at his family or he's angry at himself. Yeah, because of this guilt that he's trying to cover up and trying to hide. Again, linking back to that patriarchal society, the man really shouldn't be feeling any sort of emotion, and then he feels anxious then to follow in his father's footsteps of not actually caring about this poor girl. Okay, and the final quote then from Eric: I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty. Now, Priestley uses Eric and others to show the power that the wealthy, the bourgeois, had over the working class likes of Eva Smith. He manipulates and forces Eva into sleeping with him, subsequently leading her to become pregnant with his child. Now, had none of this happened, had he not been drinking, had he not been feeling the pressures to fulfill his family's expectations, none of this might have happened. Okay, you could argue that because he was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty, Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, was not going to argue with him. Okay, she was just going to get on with it, because she would have been seen as the inferior power in the relationship. And had there been made a fuss of, or had there been any fuss in the apartment building, it would have been Eva Smith who was thrown out by a landlord, not Eric. Okay, it would have been that Eva Smith would have led him on, and then actually she's had a sudden change of mind and she's in the wrong. But actually, when Eric drinks, we can see him becoming quite aggressive. So Eva Smith really had no other option. Okay, so Gerald Croft then, the young man who's marrying Sheila. Okay, so Gerald works at his father's business, which is bigger and more successful than Burling and Company. The Crofts are the Burling social superiors. He represents the selfish attitudes of the upper class. And I would argue that Gerald does let the audience down, as we hope and we can see potential that he's changed. Okay, so the idea that the business is more successful and it's bigger and larger are because Burling says they've always been friendly rivals. But actually now, because of this marriage, they can work together for those lower costs and those higher prices. Now, had Burling been more successful, I would argue that he wouldn't have mentioned that. Okay, because Mr. Burling is only bothered about that profit that his company makes. If he owns the bigger company, then he doesn't need to join on to anyone. He doesn't need to become in partnership with anyone. Okay, but because he understands the social standing that the Crofts have above his own family, he wants this marriage of convenience to be a business deal, so that the two companies can work together. Okay, now we've got this idea that the Crofts are the Burling social superiors, so as well as his father's business, and Mr. Burling wanting the Burlings and the Crofts to become a partnership. It also shows when Mr. Burling speaks to Gerald, and he says, Lady Croft, your mother feels you might have done better for yourself socially. Okay, so it's not that Sheila is working class and that, you know, Gerald should not even be seen in the same room as Sheila, but actually his mother, Lady Croft, feels that he could have done better. He could have married somebody who was already born into wealth and doesn't come from is not the offspring of a father who has come from a working class background. Okay, because these were often marriages of convenience, and in Edwardian times you would have the male marrying into a wealthy family, or the female marrying into a wealthy family for their fathers to work together in this sense. Okay, but actually, will that reputation of the Crofts name now be tarnished because he's marrying a Burling, for example? Okay, so Gerald Croft then, I don't come into this suicide business. Now, at the start of the play, this shows Gerald's selfish attitude is at the forefront. He cannot possibly be involved. Okay, now, because he's from this upper class family, this wealthy family, he will not have anything to do with this. He's much more powerful, or he feels he's much more powerful than the inspector, and he can't possibly be involved. It is also an example, however, of foreshadowing by Priestley. Okay, so he doesn't come into the suicide business. Well, actually, he does. Okay, you've got that difference there between foreshadowing and dramatic irony, because the audience do not know that he's involved at this stage of the play. Okay, second quote then. I'm rather more upset by this business than I probably appear to be. Now this is where we could potentially see a change in Gerald's character. He does appear to be genuinely upset by his involvement in her suicide, and actually appeared to act in kindness when he saved her from Alderman Megati in the Palace Bar. Okay, he could see that she was in trouble. He went over and saved her from Alderman Megati. Now, because of this, actually, he can't be all that bad, can he? He can't be a terrible character, in the sense that he's rescuing this poor girl who's in trouble. But actually, could we argue in the first instance that he acted on lust? Would he have approached this girl if she hadn't been this pretty young girl? So could it actually show the idea that, again, that power that the bourgeois have over the working class? Okay, he did actually cheat on Sheila. Yeah, so straight away there we see that character change. Initially, we see him as a good, kind-hearted character, saving this young woman from Alderman Megati. However, he then acts on his lust and then cheats on Sheila. Okay, he then, further on, we could argue that we could foreshadow this happening. He lets the audience down, and he is actually the one who discovers Inspector Goole is not a real inspector. He's not who he says he is. And then he's quite happy for it just to go back to normal, which leads on to our third quote. Everything's all right now, Sheila. He holds up the ring. What's about this ring? Okay, it shows his arrogance around the situation, his strong patriarchal values. He just expects Sheila to accept the engagement ring straight away. Now, bearing in mind this all occurs over one night, or a few hours in one evening, and we've had Sheila discover that Gerald cheated on her, okay, that he doesn't accept any kind of remorse in this girl's suicide, but actually towards the end, or at the end, he just expects everything to go back to normal. Yeah? What about this ring? Put this ring back on your finger, and we can get married and live a happily ever after, in a way. Again, showing his arrogance. Now this here is where we actually see Gerald Cross' true character, and we can see that he's let the audience down and shows his true identity and his selfish ways. He's only interested in getting married and maybe moving himself forward. Okay, the final character then that we're going to look at is Inspector Goole. So Inspector Goole is in his 50s, so a similar age to Mr. and Mrs. Birling. He's dressed plainly, so we've got this idea that he appears to be a normal police inspector, but actually is there something more to him? Could it perhaps be that he's a supernatural force? Okay, which then links in, and you can analyse his name, Inspector Goole, and you've got a homophone of Goole. Sounds like a ghost. You've got those different ideas that you can talk about. Okay, the stage directions describe him that he creates at once an impression of massiveness. Okay, now it does also mention in the stage directions that the actor need not be a large person. Okay, but actually the whole aura, this whole air of authority above everyone else, is suggested by the stage directions. Could you link that again in with this sinister force that he is a higher power? Okay, and just at once, as soon as he enters the stage, there is this idea of massiveness. We know actually that this is a primary character within this play who could unearth all their dirty dealings. Okay, so the fact he questions every member of the Birling household and Gerald Croft. Okay, the fact he questions everyone shows that he does not discriminate between the generation gap in the family. Okay, he suspects everyone, and he's not bothered about who he's questioning because everybody could be involved. Okay, now Inspector Goole represents Priestley's ideas. He is the voice of Priestley in the play. Okay, this is everything that Priestley stands for in character form. Okay, so a few quotes then from Inspector Goole. 2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course. Okay, now I would argue that's quite a detailed description of how the girl had died. I would say that he wants to shock the Burlings into committing their guilt or their part in her death. Okay, so early on in his interrogation of the Burlings, he's using these shock tactics. Okay, he's using these tactics to try to, or give them the chance to own up to their part in her suicide because of the detailed descriptive nature of what she has done. Now, you could argue as well that you've got the symbol of the disinfectant. Could it be that Eva Smith was trying to cleanse herself from the hurt that she had been subject to? Okay, so the whole idea of disinfectant is to, for want of a better word, disinfect and cleanse something. Now, could it be that she feels dirty, she feels that she needs to be cleansed, she needs to be clean? Okay, and that is why actually drinking the strong disinfectant, knowing that she could commit suicide, or knowing that she will commit suicide, but actually she is now pure, this disinfectant has rid her of the demons that the Burlings and Gerald have subjected her to. Okay, the second quote to Gerald: "And you think young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things." Now, obviously, we can see from stage directions, he directs this to Gerald. The inspector, I would argue, that he's picked up on the fact that Gerald appears to be a selfish misogynist. Okay, mistreats women, and uses this against him before he questions him. Okay, you could argue, or you could potentially argue, that the inspector's methods are slightly unorthodox, in that he asks these rhetorical questions that do not require an answer, when in fact, actually, should he not be unearthing the facts of what has happened, rather than trying to shock them into what they have done? Okay, and then obviously the third quote is the inspector's final speech. It was too long to copy down, but this is obviously where the inspector ends by saying that there are millions and millions of Eva Smith and John Smiths. He then goes on to say, "We don't live alone, we are members of one body, we are responsible for each other." Now, this is the inspector's final attempt at getting the Burlings to show some remorse. I would argue, and it can be portrayed in different ways on stage or how the character speaks, but you could argue that there's one way that he could have given up, and this is the last hope, and that he might act it in a bit of a melancholic way, because he's reached the end and he just can't go on any further. But the version I watched at the Lowry, he was quite angry, he was quite aggressive at this stage, and it could be that he's just lost all patience with the Burlings. Now, the thing you've got to remember here, we don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. Now, the version I watched at the Lowry Theatre, he was talking also to the audience. Okay, so here, it's, yes, the final attempt at getting the Burlings to show the remorse. However, it's different now that he's addressing everyone. Not just the Burlings, not just Gerald Croft, but he actually also addresses the audience. Okay, and he wants the audience to move forward and change their ways. He wants them to reflect on what they've done, reflect on what they can do differently so that this doesn't happen again in the future.